All right, we're kicking things off. We already have lots of people joining. Welcome everyone. Super excited. Very happy to have you here. And before we dive in, as you all settle in, drop a quick hello in the chat. Let us know where you're joining from, what you do. It's always fun to see who's in the room. Let's make sure you can message everyone. Great. So to kick things off, we got a quick poll for you. Let me launch it. It's about how many nationalities are represented in your team. I'm super curious to see just how global your teams are. As for myself, my name is Paula. I'm head of marketing at Talera, and I really cannot wait for today's conversation on driving high performance in remote teams. We are talking about cultural alignment, remote collaboration, motivating high performance, work-life balance. There's so much to cover. And for that, we have some amazing speakers lined up. And I know we're all going to leave with great insights. So first, we have Lakduk Chitra, VP of People at Leapsome with 15 years of HR experience and a history at Spotify, Teachable, really impressive. Luck knows how to boost performance and help teams click. Then we also have Noelle Pitok. She's Senior Director of Onboarding Operations at Remote, where she helps companies around the world build exceptional global teams through comprehensive hiring, payroll, and contractor solutions. We also have Anita Anthony. She's founder and CEO at Talera, where I also work. She leads a fully remote team and she offers business, English, and culture training designed for direct business impact. She works closely with HR, L&D, organizational development to really understand the challenges, the communication and cultural challenges, and then put the right packages for them. And guiding us through it all, we have Meredith Haberfeld. She'll be our amazing moderator today. She's super experienced. She is founder and CEO of Think Human, a leadership development company that helps organizations cultivate cultures where people actually want to work, love to be in, where they thrive and, they actually get to reach their highest potential. So I see you're already answering. I love the poll, by the way. We'll share it in a moment, so make sure you answer it. And I am going to let the speakers get started. So Meredith, the
All
floor
right.
is yours.
Hello, everyone from all the beautiful places that you are joining in from. Ooh, Israel, Poland, all over the United States, Buenos Aires, Saudi. So great Sweden. So great to have you all here. As you're joining, if you haven't already, please do let us know where you're coming in from. Hello, Italy. We see you there. And to all of the panelists, come on in and let's get this conversation started. As we, yes, hello, welcome. So happy to have everybody here, both you amazing panelists and this community. Hello from the North Pole. One of the things that we really appreciate is both the questions and the insights from this community. So please know this is not television. We are really interested in having your interaction in this conversation. So share your questions, share your own thoughts and how you are approaching these very challenges that we are talking about. But to get us started, let's just do a quick go round from the panelists of what is something that, as it relates to remote work, was a personal challenge you had to navigate. So finding your way in the remote environment when you first began or along the way. And as that's happening, and panelists, you all are thinking, for everybody in the community, would love to hear anything that had you or motivated you to join today's conversation. So if there was something that was like, this is a good reason for me to join, please drop it into the chat so that we know what had you be here. And at that, I'm going to turn it over to Noelle.
Ooh, all right. So one of the biggest challenges for me when I kickstarted my fully remote career, which was obviously happened with the global pandemic. That's when I shifted to be fully remote for the first time, was adjusting my schedule in a way that allowed me to not blur the lines between being home all the time and also working at home as my primary office location, if you want to call it that. And it was definitely something that took me a while to figure out because I did not succeed with calendar blocking in the beginning. I was just like, I'm going to work wherever, whenever. My house is my office. And what I actually found was that I wasn't being productive because I wasn't dialing in correctly. And I didn't have the structures and mechanisms in place to be able to say, this is what a workday looks like for me. These are the things that I foundationally need to do to start my day. This is when I'm supposed to take a break and, go do normal people things like walk the
Yeah.
dog or go pick up groceries. So I had to become quite militant, for lack of a better word, with calendar scheduling and also recognizing that it was okay for my work days to look different, but it didn't need to be a whole mishmash of hours all the time. So staggered scheduling really worked for me. That was something that I found an initial challenge for sure.
I know you just mentioned it, Noelle, but can you just say a little bit more about staggered scheduling? Because it's not something I'm
Yeah.
familiar with.
Yeah, so one of the things, like Remote is a fully global remote company. We do not have an office anywhere in the world. We're 1,800 people strong, and I have a global team that reports into me. So that means I have teams in APAC, in EMEA, and all across the Americas as well. So what I mean by staggered scheduling is on Monday, I intentionally start my day much later, probably around 10:30, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and I work into my evenings to be able to have crossover hours with my APAC leaders. It's very critical that I'm able to deliver in person to support to them. But then that means that the next day I might go and do like a 7 a.m. to a 4 p.m. to accommodate some of my EMEA team. And that really wasn't something that I did when I first started. I was just like, this is my day, and this is how my day was before I started working remotely. So when we talk
Yeah.
about staggered scheduling, it means shifting your hours to
Yeah.
be able to know that every day can look different from a timetable perspective, but you're still putting in that full day. You're still holding
Yeah.
yourself accountable to your schedule.
Right. Rather than working as some people, you're certainly not the only one who's like, well, I'm just going to be working, I guess, all around the clock to cover the whole thing.
Correct. That doesn't make for healthy work-life balance, which is essential when you are doing remote work, in my opinion, in
Yeah.
order for you to be successful, to have that energy to carry you through.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much. How about you, Luck?
Piggybacking off Noel, I think I work at a hybrid company, so we're intentionally a couple of days in the office. We have two main offices, but we have people working from wherever, currently in Germany and the US. I think the thing that was hard when I first converted to semi-remote or remote and like in previous companies was the pandemic. So it was the shock of like the system. So definitely agree with Noel in terms of like, here's my office, but it's in my bedroom. Like I definitely need a separate space for these things to happen. But I think the thing that was really hard was the deep interaction with people that I was used to having and the kind of the heuristic cues you pick up from people when you're actually in person and then converting that into this total like Zoom, Google Meet, whatever world that you can't really pick up on those things as much. And so even in previous companies where we were fully remote, some of the team was local and we still felt this need to kind of come together for meaningful time together from time to time. And that can't always be the case. And then you have these different thoughts of like, well, this person's far away. How do we make them feel connected, that it's not biased in one way when you're making judgments or decisions on things? So I think it was this interaction component that was difficult because you don't have that same, like you just come to the office at the same time and talk about the weekend and things in the same way. So you do have to think about that a little bit more and integrate that into how you're working so that you don't just feel like you're just Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting talking about like agenda points and things like that, but that you're actually working with humans at the end of the
Yes.
day behind the screen. And so I think that has been an adjustment. And so I like having some interaction from time to time, but also enjoy the flexibility of remote. But as long as you have those guardrails of like, okay, I have to end right now and I'll log back on a little bit later.
Yeah.
That sort of.
Before we go on to Anita, I just have one follow-on question, Luck. Without that human kind of like lubrication for getting things done, like what did you see the impact being in the team? Like not just for yourself, but in the org?
Yeah, no, I do think, and I feel this in the universe, maybe it's just me, but It's a little lonelier in some ways because you're not used to like just interacting via a screen. And like Noelle said, like you have to plan when you go out and walk the dog or something and interact with other people. So I do feel like it puts us all, while very flexible and great, in this other place of it feels a little bit lonelier. And I feel that in the team. I see that in engagement surveys of like needing more connection, but it's hard to really define what that connection looks like. And you can try to do all these things. And we tried doing virtual events sometimes, and sometimes they worked and sometimes they didn't. And then you can tell when there was fatigue for people being in front of the screen. So I think you really have to think about, and I think we're still in the process of that, of like, what does this really mean? What does human connection mean now in this new world? What's the glue that keeps us connected to each other? And how, as like HR leaders or leaders in general, really foster a culture, rituals that like really make it meaningful for people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're still trying to discover that, and I think each organization will do it slightly differently. But it's something that you have to be intentional about.
Yeah. One of the
Absolutely.
things as we jump, oh, go ahead, Noelle. I'm so
I was just gonna
sorry.
say that's the key word, intentionality. I was like, oh, I
Mhm.
love that word. But yeah, sorry, Meredith.
No problem, please. One of the things that I want to get to in today's conversation, and I'm sure everybody here does, is some of those things you brought up, like the fatigue that can come from Zoom after Zoom after Zoom after Zoom, and then also the loneliness and mental health implications. Here, organizations are trying to sort through productivity hacks to support teams to be as productive as possible in remote, but there are these other underlying issues like people's mental health, loneliness versus connection, and the fatigue that comes from hour after hour of staring at a screen that undermine productivity, not just affect people's mood. It's like those two things are not disconnected. So how are we sorting through that to elevate the effectiveness for organizations, which yes, care about people, but let's be honest, like, they're also beholden to stakeholders and have to manage the bottom line. So they're managing both those things. Okay, over to you, Anita. Sorry that it's taking so long to get to you. A challenge that you have faced in
Yeah.
navigating remote.
So all of the above that everybody's mentioned, I think for us it's a little bit different. So we've been remote for 8 years, so before the pandemic, and we've always been remote. And I think, we work globally, so it's this constant run, like you constantly, like the clock is going 24/7, like the day goes on Friday till the end of the day, and then it starts Sunday morning. And so you can kind of never unplug. And I think the way I handled it and we handled it was to, I'm very like taking the word intention, I really like that intentional about time blocks. So like not having Zoom meetings all day long. Like a lot of my Zoom meetings are like kind of back to back 3-4 hours. And then I really take a couple hours to debrief on everything. So I'm not trying to do everything at the same time. I think what we are also doing is like, encouraging, like if you want to do office space, like I am in the office today. We don't really have an office, but I rented an office because it makes me happy to just connect with other people in the environment. And also like finding opportunities to meet more in person. Like we've done a couple of times this year where we had like employees come to New York for a couple of days. And then we also try to really make this time where it's not just about work, but really the interperson, like we talk about the human connection. I think it's so easy to forget that there is a human. Paola and I talked about this the other day. This idea of like, you can't in a 30-minute Zoom call, you can't always tell how somebody's feeling. And so you have to kind of make this time either like, on a separate Zoom call or like, create these in-person opportunities, I think, to connect with people and just kind of stay on top. So yeah, I think time blocking is a really, really big one, and just really knowing what the workday looks like. We also, we work very flexibly. So you have like your day that might work for you, do 4 or 5 hours, you take a break, maybe do something that's important to you, come back at a later time. So just flexibility around the work schedule, but not being on 24/7, just working.
Thank you so much. And from everybody in the community, love seeing your comments in here. And I hear there's like some resonance around these same issues, and hard to remember that we're not alone. And even though many of the people, if not most of the people in this community here in this brilliant chat are people leaders, people function leaders helping solve these problems, we're also facing them and then trying to figure out how to navigate them. So how about let's talk about cultural alignment and communication styles and navigating that in a remote environment. We'll come back to some of these more mental health and loneliness questions, I promise. Let's just talk about cultural norms, communication styles, and how we can be creating higher levels of alignment. And Anita, let's pop back to you on that one.
Sure, yeah. So we obviously have these conversations with clients all the time. We do language and culture training. So cultural alignment is something that comes up all the time. And the first question I always ask is like, why? Why are you putting this on the agenda, right? Is it that you just want everybody to feel included? Do you want people to, it's the right thing to do? Or is it because your business is suffering because you don't have cultural alignment, right? That's two different things. Sometimes the company experience both, but not always. And when you are suffering from cultural misalignment, I think it's really important to get the root cause, to understand how miscommunication, how this is all affecting the business. And in my opinion, the way you do this is you have conversations. Before you do anything else, you have to have conversations. Talk with your team, talk with your colleagues, especially when you work in a global world, like also talk with the other teams, because a lot of times when there is an issue, both parties feel that issue, they just come at it from different viewpoints, right? So uncovering that is really important. Like especially when we look at culture, it's like an iceberg, right? There's these things on top that we see, like religion or clothing, the accent, how somebody speaks. But below the surface is all this other stuff, right? Like customs, my perception of time, how I view gender roles, all these things, and they really, really matter. And once you've kind of had these conversations and you figure out what all the pain points are, then you can, really reflect on that and think about like, what do I want to do now? And I think what's really important when you do this, what do I want to do now? You also have to be mindful, like what's actually possible, right? Do you work in an organization that buys into these type of things, that invests, or is there already a conversation around communication, culture, all of that? Or is that something that you're bringing to the table? And there's kind of three things, I think, once you figured out a game plan that you can do. Number one, you build a global playbook, right? Like what's the communication styles? What are our value systems? What do we do? Number two is you can bring out an outside vendor, like for example, what we do, where we help you navigate the pain points and solutions for it. And number three, and that's honestly my favorite, it's free, is you model the behavior you want to see, right? If I am in a meeting with somebody from a different culture or with a team I'm struggling, taking a couple of minutes, getting to know people, having off conversations. If you struggle with a project, having a conversation, hey, how do you feel about this? What's going on? And when you do that as a leader, everybody else will follow because employees will see what leadership does. And I think it's so important to take that extra space, encourage people to do that. And one last thing I want to say on this is, I think making any type of culture shift is so hard. It's so hard. And I think you have to give yourself grace and you have to give the team grace and you have to be okay with the journey and understand it's a work in progress and not something that just happens. For me, the biggest thing is I think once you have an awareness that you want to shift the culture or that there are misalignments or that there are issues, that's already such a great first step because a lot of people don't even notice. So I'm just going to wrap it up here, but I have a lot more to say on this.
Noelle and Luck, anyone want to jump in?
Yeah.
Thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it's a really good point that Anita is bringing up is the idea of like before you even start to figure out what your communication strategy looks like within a remote organization, you have to have a set of guiding values that's going to enable the communication structures that you want to put in place, right? Everything really starts from the core values. And I see, I hope it's Ernest or Ernst in the chat saying, what do you define cultural misalignment or alignment as? And for me, when I look at cultural misalignment, it means that I have people who are working in roles, but they're not necessarily aligned to what is most important for the business to achieve, both from an actual professional standpoint, but also from a human standpoint. Like what is the grouping of people that we want to have and what are they kind of committed to and what are those sort of North Star? I know there can really only be one North Star, but what are some of those like North Stars that everyone is holding themselves to? And if there's no connection, even at some of the most basic rungs of your organization to what that looks like at the top, it gets very confusing to people. And so for me, that's where I would see the misalignment. At remote, we have a set of guiding values that are intrinsic to everything that we do, and every policy we design, every communication strategy that we move through our teams take into account these values we have, which are care, intensity, transparency, innovation, and excellence. And they are very, very detailed in helping people understand why those behaviors and why those values make up our culture, because they actually better enable us to work remotely just by nature of them existing. So for me, it's very important that, you know, any organization who is looking to go remote, or they are maybe half hybrid, half remote, and they want to go make that full shift, are your values as a company going to be setting you up for success to be able to have the necessary individuals that you want within your organization who are going to be fantastic remote leaders, or individuals who are going to thrive in a fully remote environment? And it's not easy, right? Like these are core defining discussions that business leaders have to have about what matters to them and to their organization and then to their customers, right? So they're really nuanced. But for us, when we look at the documentation that we have around communication and how we look at really introducing members of the team globally to each other, all of that can't be done if people aren't sort of within that same playing field and in that same space, that these are the expectations of them. When that's clear, right, then we can enable that next layer of how are we listening to each other? How are we getting team members from different parts of the globe to interact with one another? And how are we building that into things like our training programs when we onboard new people into the organization? So we're forcing, again, intentional cross-border collaboration. So yeah.
Yeah, and no, I'll just piggyback again. I agree with the intention, and as y'all are talking, I think it's really important to know where you are in an organization. So I've noticed when I've been at smaller companies and you're, you know, even though you're remote or global, you can sort of see each other as another person on the other side. And then as you scale, it gets a little bit trickier. And then you start hearing words like us and them and over there, and you know, and you're sort of are automatically as a human differentiating. And then I think this is where it's important to be really intentional. And I think it's hard to be at the end state. And I think it's all a process. So every communication, every learning, how you introduce yourselves in meetings, what the rituals are, I think it's a whole process of discovery to make sure, like, what are we talking about? Like, I think for people leaders and leaders in general is, again, to make sure you're listening to what's happening, because that's where the cultural misalignment can start to happen. And you have to pick up on those cues really quickly and like iterate. Like maybe you don't have all the values mapped out yet, but like then think really hard about what really matters and start defining it. And each step along the way, making sure you're documenting that, putting that in place, talking about it. So if we see something is like, oh, I'm hearing this. I was just meeting with one of my team members. We're looking at engagement survey data, and something was like, I don't feel like people are listening. I'm like, okay, well, why is that? Who is that? Let's really dig deep into this, and then let's address it with everybody in terms of what's happening. And I feel like this is when, if you don't listen to that feedback or that noise, and then you kind of ignore it and you just move on, this is where then this little molehill becomes the big mountain of the big cultural shift. And then like it should become part of the rhythm and the practice of saying, okay, we're going to document the things, we're going to talk about it, this is a living document, this is a living experience that we're doing, especially as the company scales, as you know, the world conditions shift and things like that. And I think it's really making sure you're listening to the people that are working there and experiencing everything, and again modeling, like Anita and Noelle said, to be that leader that listens and that
Yes.
takes a pause to then make the intentional like game plan.
Like, I
Yeah.
have a question for you now. Do you like one of the things that we see in companies is that there's sometimes a disconnect, right? Like the employees want it, maybe leadership wants it, and maybe middle management is like, we're too busy, we don't have time for this, or like how have you seen that play out in your organizations? I'm very curious.
Yeah, no, a great question. I do think you need everyone on board, right? And so exactly what you said, if the top leaders aren't living and breathing and modeling the behavior, how do we expect anybody else to? I've often seen if the leader doesn't engage, but all the employees are super engaged, are super excited and super passionate, it doesn't work because the top leader is ignoring everything that needs to happen. So when it comes to leadership training and bringing folks into the to train, I think somebody, Amy in the chat said they have multicultural workshops. I found that if we don't have leaders work through this, and I think I've done this with Meredith at previous companies as well, if we don't have the top leaders doing and modeling the behavior, it just sort of falls flat. And then some people who buy in initially, even middle managers, they start to lose the passion for it, because it's like, if my boss isn't doing it, why wouldn't I do it? So I do think there needs to be clear from the top alignment on what it is, even if it's a work in process, even if it's a journey for that person, let that journey be a lesson and like integrate that into the organization, because that's the only way it really sticks. Otherwise, it's just sort of like a check the box exercise.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, it's really interesting, the whole concept about remote work that I have found to be the most professionally enriching for myself, and what I believe for some of the leaders on my team, they probably would say the same thing, is we are being challenged constantly. And I say this in a good way, right? This is not confrontational challenge. This is not conflict, but this is perspective challenge, right? Because for those of us who have come from companies that may have been very regional dynamically, like I came from an all North American company prior to joining remote, it took a lot of me listening, being quiet, doing the research, and actually trying to understand the way in which different cultures communicate around the globe. Because, what I didn't realize is that for some of my team in APAC, it was disconcerting for them to hear from me as a senior leader within the organization with no previous context, right? And I wouldn't have been able to know that if I didn't actually spend time speaking with individuals, not necessarily leaders. This is very important because leaders sometimes have their own view of things. But if I didn't actually speak to individuals who were living and working in that region, being like, if I want this to land well, what are your recommendations for me? What do you expect me to keep in mind, right? And I plug this book every time because I shameless plug it. But for me, reading a book called The Culture Map by Erin Meyer was so important in me helping to understand the different spectrum of communication. But it takes you as a leader to step back and challenge your perspective, because the way you think about something and the way you would communicate it isn't always the right way to do it for the audience that you intend it to land best in, right? And so that is where this idea of having these conversations that come up naturally, like I know sometimes I can solve things in a Slack message, but I sometimes just am like randomly, hey, you want to hop in a huddle? Like, let's just get to know each other for 2 seconds. That's my force. Like, I'm bumping into you at the water cooler when there is no water cooler. And I have found that to be very helpful, because the more exposure that I have to those individuals, the more I'm able to perceive their own communication styles. And that challenges my own internal perception of it, and then forces me to also challenge my leadership team accordingly. So, yeah.
Mm. One of the things that's really standing out to me in this part of the conversation is that we've moved into a stage of the world of work that requires so much agility from leaders that you can't come with like, I know how to do this. Check the box. Like I've got the playbook and I'm using it. That is in this context counterproductive, but that the things you all are talking about sound, to me at least, like they're built on this foundation of growth mindset, agility, listening for the issues, not finding those issues confronting, or at least moving past your trigger of whatever, moving past that so that you can get to like, okay, what is at the bottom of this? It's okay if I'm wrong. It's okay if I'm doing it wrong. Don't have to have anybody feel bad or shame about that. And how do we pivot and get better at this? Which I think is like an interesting mode to be in. And it makes me think also about hiring. Noelle, you had said in an earlier conversation something about not everybody, remote's not for everybody. So you want to say more about that?
Yeah, you're putting me on the hot spot. You're like, she said road is a private, but no, there is, I do truly believe that it takes a certain individual, both in the leadership side and also on the individual side, to succeed and find remote work professionally fulfilling, because there is a certain element of isolation to it. And it was really funny. We were all at an offsite recently, which only happens once a year for us at the senior leadership level. But a lot of us were very nervous because we're core introverts at heart, right? A lot of us who gravitate to remote work are secretly like, there's a part of us that really likes that. And I love that, because I am very extroverted at work, but introverted in my personal life, right? And so I think for me, it's very critical that when you are looking at blending more of a remote focused into your organization, whether that's moving from fully in to hybrid to fully remote, you need to start defining what successful talent looks like and what type of individuals are likely to succeed. And what that means is that you need to have a very robust hiring process, and not a robust hiring process, meaning like we need to have 8 levels of interviews. And, that's not what I'm referring to. What I'm referring to here is intentional alignment within the organization as to the kinds of experiences that people bring from their past careers before they come to a fully remote organization. And we've seen success in our company with people who have been fully in person and they've transitioned to fully remote work, right? We've seen some things that aren't successful, right? And it's just because the human nature in general is very much a spectrum, right? As is everything in life. But identifying the characteristics that you're looking for to be successful in a leadership team is very, very important, remote wise, because they kind of hold the bar that everybody, then kind of falls under. But yeah, we look for people who are good decision makers, who are, take a lot of care and intentionality in their communications. They're patient. They assume good first intent. They have generalist backgrounds, so they're comfortable with, different things flying around. People who crave that fast pace. These are all things that we really, really dig into in our hiring processes because we know from our experience that they are more likely to track internally within our organization in terms of a culture fit.
Have any of you, Anita or Luck, sorry, either of you, I should say, experienced in the transition to either remote or hybrid leaders in the organization who were solid leaders in a co-located in-person environment, and all of a sudden we're like, oh, a little more wobbly, and what that looked like, including if it looked like them blaming their teams or blaming a remote situation for the issues. I'm also interested to know in the chat if that's something that any of you have seen as leaders who just couldn't, not, I don't want to say couldn't, but didn't effectively just like flip the switch and have the skills to do it well, and what that looked like. Luck or Anita, either of you?
I'm thinking I haven't really. Yeah, I need to. I think most of the people who work with remote first.
While you're thinking, one of the things I've seen is leaders who prefer the in-person environment kind of write off the options because of their own preferences and expecting the organization to flex to their preferences rather than them needing to expand their skills. And maybe others are not seeing that, but that's something I feel like we at Think Human are seeing a fair amount of in our clients. Yeah, go ahead, Luck. I see you nodding.
No, yeah, I was going to agree with that. I think there's definitely some folks that do that. If it's a hybrid and you have an option, then there's like well, I like coming in, so you're coming in with me. But I've also seen not so much that leaders can't perform in this way, but that some bias might seep in for folks that might not be remote or nearby enough. If they don't have some of the skills that Noelle said, like the ability to think about the other side and like how they communicate and all of that kind of stuff. And then that really interfering with that relationship, particularly if that person is having a harder time. So I think we're talking about the leaders here, but also some employees. This is a new experience and you might think you want remote and you might like the idea of it, but then when you actually do it, it might be difficult. And sometimes when there's not that pause from the leader or that person to have the language to talk about it together to then kind of get back on the right track, you can start discounting that person. You can, and then this is where HR has to get involved of like what's happening. And unfortunately, some of those leads to performance improvement. And it might just be like, hey, we never really created that connection to begin with, or there's this expectation that this person should be working a certain way, but it might be different. So I've seen it kind of come up in that kind of environment.
Yeah, interesting. And I'm seeing in the chat also Alex and Chuck pointing out something I think fits really well on the heels of that leaders who are less adaptable struggle more, and leaders that remote or hybrid can reveal leadership weakness that was kind of covered over in a co-located environment. But once you have to actually flex those leadership skills, they might be missing, but that when leadership development is invested in, if leaders are willing and open, that they're able to grow those skills and improve. So, kind of that gift that keeps on giving, that once you put that, give them those skills, they can enhance it out into the rest of the org. Let's talk for a minute about motivation. It's kind of on in the general category of leadership skills, and how are you seeing motivation work inside of remote or hybrid teams, and how is it different and from traditional in-person? Like what's working and what's not? And Noelle, if you don't mind jumping in first.
Yeah, so one of the things that I have found very integral for my team and my org specifically in order to motivate them was just having a very clear understanding of what performance expectations actually were. And when remote started, I mean, I joined remote at the end of 2021, so it was still very much like early stage startup phase. I think I was employee number 400 back in the day. We really had no like guiding documentation around like what is expected of us. We were just working. We were coming in every day. We were doing a whole bunch of work, and people had no idea what they were successful at or not successful at. And so, in order for us to actually start figuring out how to motivate high performance, the first thing we needed to do was define it. And I think the thing that I love about remote work is it forces you to document everything. It forces you to lean into what we talk about is like asynchronous communication, which is when we're not spending time on meetings or on Zoom calls, but when we're relying on written documentation to move our organization forward. And I think about a lot of physical offices, you don't necessarily always think about doing this because you just come into work every day and you're observing people. You can see people in meetings. There's social cues that you can pick up on. You can see other people's engagement. When everyone's at home sitting in front of their computer, people need to understand, number one, what's actually expected of them, but number two, like, how does living out the company values actually function when you're not going to a company, you're just sitting in front of your desk, right? So for us, it was less about kind of like, I want to say incentives right out the gate. And it was more about actually sitting down with our leadership team, my entire leadership team, and defining what does performance look like for each level? What does success in the role look like for each level? And then the other part of it, which is absolutely critical, which again has to be done with a lot more, I keep saying it, intentionality when you're working remotely, is having deep conversations with individuals about what motivates them. Like what is driving them in the workplace, because something is different for everybody. For some people, it's about title. For other people, it's about recognition. For some, it's about salary, right? You don't have the opportunity to just bump into someone or say, hey, like, I'd love to go out for lunch with you, like, and then you kind of get into that organically somehow. So it's very important that the leadership team is enabled to have these kinds of really in-depth conversations with their staff in a way that they probably usually would if we weren't just doing it in a one-to-one every week. So for me, those were like the two key areas to start in terms of ways in which that our team could also feel motivated, that the company was invested in them. Number one, by setting clear expectations for what's expected of them. Number two, clear expectations for how they can get to the next level. And then number three, making sure every single manager is equipped with the toolkit to have the conversations about what matters most to each individual. And then, of course, you do some fun things every once in a while. You sprinkle in some virtual team building events. You try and encourage a culture where you ask a lot of questions. But there's no really one size fits all approach to motivating high performance. At the end of the day, have a great culture, hire people you trust, drive forward asynchronous communication, and actually care about getting to know your team members and what matters to them.
I totally agree with Noelle. Like, I think that personalized motivation is so important. I also think specifically in the remote world, like visibility is key. Because it's exactly what you said, right? You're not going to see who's showing up. We're very outcome driven, so we care less about like, are you hitting all the tasks? So it's easy to sit in an office, right, and seem busy. But when you're outcome driven, it's not so easy, right? Like these are your metrics. This is what we're going to go for. There's a couple of things that I think about. Like, I think it's so important to train managers to highlight people, because I think also in the day-to-day, it's very easy to forget, like in one-on-one and virtual stand-ups. What we do at Talera also, we have like a dedicated Slack channel, for example, to really make sure people get the public recognition they deserve. We can use different tools. It's really nice. And then I think it's also super important to align the motivation with your work culture. So for example, if you're a startup, you maybe move fast, you want people to take risks. So you need to make sure that people don't get in trouble, right, when they fail, because it's much easier to fail when you take risk versus when you're like slow and steady. You maybe reward consistency. So I think that's all super important. I also think it's super important to build like psychological safety, like a climate of trust, making sure people can really go for things to be the best they can be and contribute to the organization.
Yeah, I think
Look,
plus one.
when you answer, if there's anything you can also add in response to somebody, hold on, where is this? Can you dig deeper into after the motivation conversation, how do you adjust to individual motivation as a leader of leaders? So in your answer, if you don't mind trying to weave that in.
Yeah. No, plus one to everything Noelle and Anita said. I think that captures a lot of it. And then back to kind of delighting everyone. I feel like they're in the virtual world where you're living and doing things in different times in different places. You're this multifaceted person, but you still at your core, I think, want to be seen as an individual, as a person who's contributing. And so I found that when your manager or your team can really see you and understand you and take that time for that relationship, and then do those nice, delightful things to say, oh, I noticed this, and comment on something, I think that really motivates you to be part of this team, and you feel part of the purpose, and you feel part of all of this together. And I think this is the thing when it comes to leaders and making sure, like we're experiencing this now, we have, on Leapsome, you can praise people, you put in the Slack channel, so it's great. So everyone sort of knows what different team members are doing, and it's really great on a global perspective. And so you see that on a dashboard. But then at the end of the day, you're like, oh, but I did this. Did you see what I did? And making sure leaders really step up and call it out. So we are inundated with every kind of communication, email, text, like Slack, whatever it is. And sometimes you miss these things. And so leaders have to set the tone, again, back to that theme of intentional leaders, showing up is, hey, making sure that we're making that recognition known, that we are actively doing something to make it stand out, right? And we have to adapt to the environment. Like if we know Slack is heavy, making sure we do it in a newsletter, or making sure, and like you have to keep adapting your rituals to make sure that there's things that are expected, that are common, but once that gets a little bit like kind of in the background again, you've got to like innovate and level up and think about it again. Because again, this is a dynamic environment. I think someone put in the chat also like the generations of things. So we're bringing a lot of different generations into the workforce. Everyone has a different kind of expectation, experience, but at the end of the day, they just want to know that what they're doing really contributes and has impact, and that you've seen the hard work. You've seen the output, but you've also seen how like intentional they've been at working hard on something that might be difficult for them. So I think it's a lot of making sure that you see what your teams are doing, and how you track that, and making sure that you have that moment, just like when you have with kids, like making sure that kid feels special sometimes, I think that goes a long way, especially if you're not in person.
Hey, Anita, one of the things that I remember we were talking about earlier was our love of Loom, right? And how it's such a great tool. And shameless plug for Loom. We love Loom at Remote. One of the best things about this is, for all of our leaders and for anyone really, not just to use it. For those of you who don't know what Loom is, it's actually like it's a screen recorder and also video recorder at the same time. So it allows you to record and edit video messages. And we use it for a variety of functions, for training, for sharing important info. But one of the things that my leadership team has found a lot of success in doing is just recording, affirmational Looms where we go in, we thank the team, we say, hey, this is what we know you guys accomplished, and just having that face, like showing up and presence is something that is super important and should not be underestimated. I also am a big fan of voice notes in Slack. It adds a human element to it. I know some people are like, oh, I don't want to listen to it, but there's always a way to get like a transcript. At the end of the day, I want to express gratitude in a multitude of different ways for my team, right? I want to use the thank channel in Slack. I want to slide into their DMs and do it. I want to, share it with their manager if they see something about it. So actually, one of my senior managers as well, she created this awesome thing that we now use organizationally at Remote called the brag document, because there's so much happening remote. This is a Notion page where they can go in and drop in all the things that they do. And so, yes, it's important. You need to infuse, Luck, to your point, that idea of bringing up and bubbling up, the good, again, in an intentional way so that it's visible. But yeah, Anita, how do you guys leverage Loom and or other motivational tools?
Oh, so it's funny. We just actually sent out a Loom to all of our contractors like a week ago, and we got so many emails back and messages. People were so happy. And it was like a minute just talking to the contractors, everything we've done and what they done and how it contributed. It was really nice. So we love Loom because we use it for like, let's say you're working on a big project, right, or design piece, and you need feedback. You can just record it, let the people watch it whenever they are ready for it. I love that you can comment in the video. It's awesome. But no, I actually wanted to kind of circle back real quick on something you said about like the DMs and all of that. I think with the motivation, it's also so important that you do it on a continuous basis. I think sometimes there's like, oh, we'll wait for like the performance review to say how awesome something is. Like, no, do it on an ongoing basis, and not just about the big ticket stuff. Like, I have an employee who like a couple of weeks ago just did something that was just very kind of took charge of something. It was a small thing, but it actually had a huge impact. And like making sure you call that out, right? Because I think for people, it's so important to be seen in the day-to-day on the job, and not just because otherwise you also live in this vacuum. You don't know what's happening. So yeah, I love Loom, love Slack, love just picking up the phone real quick and saying, hey, you're doing a great job. I'm seeing it. Yeah. And by the way, I mean, oh, so go ahead. Go ahead.
No, please, Anita, finish what you were saying.
No, I was just gonna, we're just talking about tools. I just want to actually say a quick note on another tool we love is Slack. I know we've brought up Slack a few times. I imagine most on the call know Slack, but if you don't, I've described it to my dad as like WhatsApp for the workplace. And it's such a nice real-time collaboration tool to kind of really stay in tune with everybody. And I think somebody, Noel, like mentioned earlier, kind of like core hours when everybody works. And I think that's like when you really kind of want to be online and do all of these things, connect with your team, move things forward. So, but Meredith, please go ahead.
A couple things. Firstly, I don't want to step over because it didn't come out earlier in the conversation, then just really highlighting this idea of core hours. We've talked a bit about time, and I just want to kind of highlight that core hours, I think what you're saying is that, yes, people are flexing their hours to cover all different time zones, but having those core hours where there is overlap enables certain kinds of communication that can't happen otherwise. Similar to, Noelle, I think you said earlier, knowing when to jump in a huddle, or maybe that was you, Luck, but that there's a lot that can happen asynchronously, but some things shouldn't happen asynchronously, and having the right structure to support that and the right organizational norms. In terms of asynchronous communication, anything that other than Loom that you have, and Slack, that you have found that you want to, whether it's in the chat, hearing from the community or from our panelists, that you have found really helpful to enable effective, strong, asynchronous communication, whether that's how you're training people or how you're structuring things.
So there's two things that I think are important. Number one is setting really clear expectations around communication styles, response time, things like that. And then the second thing kind of related to that is being an over communicator. I think it's really, really important that you over communicate, because it's so easy to get lost in remote work. If you're working, in the PST in a Western time zone, and you work with somebody in Europe, you're working together on a project. If you don't do a proper handover the next day, the other person can't pick up. So that's the kind of two things, like having very clear expectations on things, and then like communicating all day long. I think that's super important to keep things going and keep things smooth, and let everybody maximize their time that they're online.
So it's interesting that you say that. So one of the things that I try and remember to do is try and write down my thoughts publicly within the organization, assuming obviously they're not privileged, or there's like they're sensitive of a specific nature. But one of the things that I try and encourage my leadership team to do is to think out loud, which is, we would probably be doing this if we were all physically located in the same space. We would just be like, oh, what do you think about this? But instead, when you're at your desk and you're just by yourself, sometimes it's easy to just like keep it locked into your own head. So what we are really trying to do is encourage that idea of, if you have something that you want to speak to, you should speak to it. And we actually leverage Notion quite a bit at Remote, which is a document tool which has been very transformational for our organization. But one of the things where
you move on off of Notion, just to share with people, why is it better for your organization than the other things that are out there? Like what's unique?
So it is really it's a collaborative documentation tool. So typically, like if you're looking at a traditional suite of, our office products, your document tool, you create a document and you'd have to put it in a SharePoint, share it with someone. Doesn't make it super easy to, do commenting and inline editing and suggesting. So Notion really enables our organization to do real-time project collaboration. It can do everything, forms, tables, all that kind of good stuff. But one of the things that a lot of people are always very curious to know about when I tell them is that And I've had the same leadership team for a long time, and they're absolutely amazing. But we run all of our weekly managers meetings entirely asynchronously now, which means that instead of meeting as a group, because we have leaders in every corner of the world, instead of doing that every Thursday, every Tuesday by the close of your business, you are required to put your updates in the document. On the Wednesday, everyone's going in there and pinging, oh, amazing, what are you doing here? Oh, and it's like this collaborative document that essentially lives for our team for 48 hours. So the meeting essentially takes place over the course of 2 full work days, but we get much more collaboration out of it than we would, because it would be basically impossible for us to have my Americas regions managers and my EMEA managers and my APAC managers all in the same room at the same time. So changing the time frame of that collaboration and using a tool like Notion has been very, very helpful for our team, because we can also embed looms in there and we can drop hot links to other projects, and it's become this living organic document that's for two days a week is just hot, and all my managers are chatting and they're all having an equal opportunity to express themselves, which is very important when, you know, parts of the business are fully sleeping when other parts of the business are fully awake. So that's an example of how we leverage Notion to support our asynchronous work environment.
I really love the paper trail also you have in Notion, where so much
Yes.
in person, you would just kind of conversations would go wherever. And what's really cool about Notion too is they have this conversational interface. So it's like when you have a bunch of docs, nobody reads it, right? But then here you can also search and find things that are important to you. So I totally agree with you, Noelle. It's a fantastic tool. And I think, yeah, somebody from my team wrote, it took a moment to get used to it, and it did take us a moment. And now we can't imagine a world.
I definitely, it's a learning curve on Notion, but it's definitely been a tool that has been super helpful for global cross-pollination, sharing, et cetera. And then just to piggyback on what Noelle said too, like just sharing your thoughts out loud, I think is also another adjustment of like putting things in group channels versus just in direct DMs, so that more people have the context of what's needed, and knowing exactly, you know, as long as it's not privileged, et cetera, but knowing, and that was an adjustment for me too as an HR leader, being like, what can I share? But now it's more like you have to, again, intentionally share all of these things in broader spaces so that everyone can kind of get the context.
That's so true. It's so true. Like our amazing CEO, Yob, says it best, no private channels, right? I mean, obviously there's the case for some within the business, but no private channels. We want the work that we're doing to be visible throughout the whole entire organization. Definitely takes a lot more, you know, self-organization, and that's something we invest a lot in enabling our team to do. But yeah, we want conversations out in the open, because there should be really nothing to hide when it comes to the way we're all operating globally. So anytime we see a private channel that can be public, especially as leaders, we're like, open it up. There's nothing here that should not be shared. So get it out there.
Thematically, I just keep hearing reinforcement of this idea that good leadership can hide in like the lack of good leadership, I should say, or good practices can hide in a co-located environment, because you can cover over it with like, oh, we passed each other in the hall. I didn't know that piece of information, but I got it later, versus in a remote or hybrid environment, those things like you got to get them in a really solid way. I will say at Think Human, we are historically a bunch of talkers, like getting all the information out verbally. And as we spread across the globe, obviously that started to break down, and having a tool where every bit of information lives, not where you have to search through it in a Slack channel, but in a clear, like, this is where you go to find this information. For us, we use we use ClickUp. Some people use Asana, lots of different tools for this. But having really super clear norms about where information had to live so everybody could find it at any time was just like, and it was a painful transition for us talkers. Like, we just want to be able to talk about it and sort through it, moving it to async, but it made such a difference in productivity. All right, before we run out of time, I want to make sure to come back to this topic of loneliness, Zoom fatigue, connection, and what things you've put in place in your organizations to solve for that and to elevate the level of human connection. A bunch of things we've talked about already, like looms and recognition, but really creating that sense of human connection, feeling like you are actually not just seen from afar, but like create that human to human. What are the things that you have done and seen work? And in the chat, please share with us as well everything you've learned about that.
Oh, I'm gonna go first because this is something I didn't do, and this is something one of my senior level individual contributors challenged me to do. Oftentimes when I get into a one-to-one with one of my team members, I'm all business right away. I'm like, okay, this is the docket, this is everything that we need to talk about. That's where my brain goes because I have to move fast, I have to compartmentalize, and I'm just like, okay, let's get it done. And they said, I've been working with you for, 2.5 years, and I feel like we still don't know very much about each other. And I was like, yeah, you know what, you're right. So they gave me a 5-minute challenge, which is at the 5 minutes of every one-to-one, before I talk business, we have to just talk about our lives, like who we are as humans, what's going on in our work week, what matters to us. Did we have a great dinner? Did we have a funny phone call from one of our parents? Integrating that into the structure of the one-to-one was something that the old me would have been like, I could have been maximizing those 5 minutes of productivity on working through work, but it is actually create that single 5 minutes just before we get into the nuts and bolts every single week has really helped build such a stronger relationship of understanding what's going on with that person in their life. And I was very grateful that they challenged me on that one. And that's what I mean. You have to be challenged, right? You have to learn. So definitely carving out a spot in your one-to-one to just talk human, not talk business, important.
I also think about for some people, it's exactly what you said, Noelle. It's really important to have that kind of the 5 minutes. Other people want to go straight to business, right? So I also try to figure out with clients or also coworkers, who is that person? Like going back to the personalized motivation earlier, right? Some people are like, no, I don't actually want to have that time. I want to go straight to work. So that's that I think that's something that I think about a lot. Like, what do people respond to and what's important to them? And then the other thing is not every meeting is the same, right? If you're in crunch time for something, everybody just wants to get home and get stuff done. That's probably not the time where I'm going to take that time from you. But then, we have, hey, it's a Friday or, things are a little slower, then giving that space. And then maybe it's even more time. So I'm also always trying to be a little bit aware of like where we are as an organization, where is that person that I'm talking to figure out, is that the time or is it not? And then I also think active listening is so important. It sounds very basic, but I think a lot of people don't listen. And I think when somebody tells you something, you got to remember it and come back to it in 3 months. I think that is what builds relationships, right? Because I think that's genuine and that is what builds the bond. And I think that is also what makes people feel included and part of a team and part of this entire organization feels like the manager cares.
I think what Leapsome's done really well since I've joined here is we do that sort of check-in at a lot of meetings. So at the senior leadership meeting, someone will ask like, hey, how's your week? Give a number, or what's something funny, an icebreaker. So integrating these icebreakers, they feel a little bit hokey sometimes, but then when you actually get people talking about it, it loosens up the conversation. It makes it a little bit more playful. And we also do this at our all hands bi-weekly, where we have somebody in the company do an intro and they add an icebreaker, or if we do these other regional team meetings, someone's introducing themselves in a certain way. So you kind of normalize that you're a human. There's more to you than just what you're doing, behind the computer. But like we make this part of our culture, something that we care about, and leaders do it. So we all can play, we all can be more human versus just getting down to business, though we do want to get down to business too.
The other thing too that I have found super helpful is once somebody's onboarded with our organization, the manager gets to know them a little bit. It's helpful for them to suggest we have a lot of social Slack channels within our organization. Some are really, really specific, like you would just never know that they exist, right? Like there's one for our coffee aficionados, there's one for fans of RuPaul's Drag Race, which I founded, yes. So I think that the goal is that once the manager gets to know that person a little bit, they offer some personalized recommendations on different like little micro communities within the organizations that people can join, which is also very important as well to like just to further your own sort of DEIB initiatives at any company is also good to look out for. So there's a Slack channel for everything at Remote, and if there isn't, we can probably create one. So yeah, that's what I also recommend as well is connecting. You have to, again, intentional connection to those different communities to have spaces for those people to express themselves outside of just work.
Yes. Jessica in the chat, the employee personal user guide, such a good idea. And Noelle, something I just really appreciate that you're highlighting, but has come out throughout this entire conversation, is that there are some things that at the leadership or organizational level, I should say, organizational level, have to be structurally set up. Like, how are you at the organizational level recognizing people's impact and setting up the right asynchronous tools and having the right rituals? And then there are some things at the functional level, the head of a function has to really establish, like, somebody I think in the chat said about the newsletter for getting to know people. And then there's a whole host of stuff that lives at the manager level. Some of the things that I heard were learning what's motivating about somebody, making personalized recommendations to somebody so that they can get that level of connection, being really good at setting people up with clarity, and so many more things. But there's really these different dimensions that we have to be operating at. In our last, like, everybody gets 30 seconds here, and I want this from the chat too. Will everybody share one thing that it's like, if you're only going to do one thing to elevate how effective your remote environment is, what is that one thing? So we want to hear from you in the chat. And then Noelle, if you would kick us off from the panelists.
Yeah, don't underestimate the power of communication. Is so integral. Really, like, concise, non-jargony, fast, effective, decision-driven communication that's done with kindness and empathy, and also impact is so key. So you need to invest in leaders who are going to prioritize being exceptional communicators within the organization, and hiring talent that has a strong penchant for written and also spoken communication.
Adding on to that, don't assume, like, always ask questions. I think asking questions is really, really important, especially when you are in a remote environment. If you're not sure, ask question.
Yeah, all of that. And then just the nuance to it in terms of the communication. I think it's great to be direct and all this, but remember when you zoom out, the storytelling and the narrative and how you tell that story to keep everyone motivated for the long haul is also super human and super important. Because in the snappy communication, you lose some of that and then you start feeling lonely. So I would say making sure there's a story, a narrative, a why behind why you're doing everything.
So good. All right. Thank you, everybody. You brilliant, amazing panelists, this awesome community. Have a beautiful rest of your day. And thank you so much for participating and sharing your wisdom. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.